They said she was too small to be a real threat. Staff Sergeant Jake Brennan announced it loud enough for the whole training pit to hear his voice carrying across the red Georgia clay like a challenge written in the air itself. 28-year-old Captain Elena Ravencroft stood motionless in the center of the combatives' ring at Fort Moore's Maneuver Center of Excellence, her Army combat uniform already dark with sweat in the afternoon heat, while three male soldiers circled her like wolves who'd cornered something they didn't understand. They saw a compact woman, 5'4", who'd somehow landed in their modern Army combatives Level 4 instructor course. What they couldn't see was the small dragon silhouette tattooed on her inner right wrist, a mark no bigger than a quarter that told a story none of them would believe. What they couldn't know was that in 72 hours, Brennan would be on he back in that same ring, staring at the Georgia sky, wondering what he'd just tried to fight. But that comes later. The afternoon sun beat down on the training area behind Building 4, turning the air thick and oppressive. Heat shimmered off the tin roofs of the complex, and the smell of pine sap mixed with sweat and dust created that particular perfume of military installations in the Deep South. The combatives' ring was a 20-foot square of packed dirt bordered by weathered railroad ties, surrounded by bleachers where a dozen soldiers sat with crossed arms and expressions that said they'd already made up their minds about what they were seeing. This is where it begins, not with the fight, with the arrival. 72 hours earlier, Elena had stepped off a commercial bus at the Fort Moore main gate, a single rucksack slung over one shoulder, moving with an economy of motion that some mistook for hesitation. It was actually the careful stillness of someone who'd learned that wasted movement could cost lives. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight regulation bun, revealing a lean face marked by sharp cheekbones and a thin scar that cut through her left eyebrow. The scar was from Afghanistan. Most of her important memories were. She was small, compact, built like a distance runner rather than a brawler. Men always made assumptions about that. Her uniform showed its age-faded, irrational camouflage pattern from too many field rotations. Sleeves rolled precisely to mid-forearm, according to regulation. On her right inner wrist, barely visible, unless you knew to look, was that dragon tattoo. When she thought no one was watching her, left thumb would press against it just for a second, like checking a touchstone to make sure it was still there. Command Sergeant Major Raymond Thorne stood near the company headquarters building when she arrived, clipboard in hand, jaw working a piece of gum. He was 62 years old, 40 years in service, and he'd seen enough soldiers to know when something didn't add up. Elena's service record showed standard infantry time at a deployment to Afghanistan in 2020 and 2021, and then 14 months of entries marked simply training, specialized program, before her reassignment stateside. The classification markers on those entries were the kind that made people stop asking questions. He'd tried asking once in the informal way senior NCOs have of gathering information without making it official. She'd smiled politely and changed the subject so smoothly he almost didn't notice it happening. Across the training area that first morning stood Staff Sergeant Jake Brennan and his crew. Brennan was 32, 6'2", 220 pounds, with the build of someone who'd spent his entire adult life in the gym. He'd earned his Ranger tab the hard way, carried a combat infantryman badge on his chest, and moved through the world like he owned whatever ground his boots touched. His training partners were Sergeant Craig Dalton and Specialist Tyler Westbrook. Dalton was shorter, thicker, the kind of man who followed stronger personalities because it was easier than thinking for himself. Westbrook was lean and wary, 22 years old, still new enough to the Army that he thought aggression was the same as competence. They'd been circling Elena since the morning formation, making comments just loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Brennan kept calling her the diversity hire. Dalton laughed at every joke like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Westbrook watched her the way someone watches an animal they're planning to corner, waiting to see if it would run or fight. What none of them knew was that Elena had already fought this fight 100 times in her mind in a dozen different variations, and she'd won every single one. The story doesn't start at Fort Moore, though. It starts earlier in places most of these soldiers had never been doing, things that officially never happened. But before that, it starts in Seattle. 16 years earlier, in a garage that smelled like motor oil and old leather, a different version of Elena was learning the fundamentals of a different kind of war. The rain hammered on the roof of the detached garage behind the small house in Seattle's Rainier Valley neighborhood. Elena Ravencroft was 14 years old, wearing sweatpants and a tank top, bare feet on the cold concrete floor, while her father demonstrated a defensive technique for the third time with the patience of someone who understood that real learning couldn't be rushed. Master Sergeant Thomas Ravencroft, United States Marine Corps retired, was 58 years old that year. He'd served from 1908 to 96 Force Reconnaissance with a combat deployment to Desert Storm that he rarely talked about in specific terms, but which had left him with a slight limp in his left leg and a medical retirement that came earlier than he'd wanted. His hands were scarred from a vehicle fire during the war, thick calluses across the palms, but they moved with surprising gentleness as he adjusted Elena's stance. "Your weight is too far forward," he said, his voice carrying that particular quality of men who'd spent years giving orders in combat zones. Not loud, but absolutely clear. "You commit too early. They'll read it and counter. Stay neutral until you're ready to move." Elena adjusted, shifting her weight back, centering herself. Thomas nodded once, then moved in slow motion through the technique again. It was a basic wrist release, the kind of thing that looks simple until you tried to do it under pressure against someone bigger and stronger. He'd been teaching her since she was, well, first the basic movements, then the principles, then the philosophy underneath it all. "In my war," Thomas said, stepping back and gesturing for her to try it on him, "we learned something important. In the places we operated, we couldn't access half the population. Women, children, they had intelligence we needed, medical needs we could have helped with. But we were all men, and their culture wouldn't allow it. That was our blind spot. We lost people because of it." Elena executed the wrist release, breaking his grip and creating distance. Thomas smiled slightly. "Future wars," he continued, "won't be like the old ones. They'll need warriors like you, soldiers who can go places men can't, do things men can't do. You'll be what we needed and didn't have." "You think there'll be women in combat?" Elena asked, resetting her stance. "I know there will be," Thomas said. "Question is whether they'll be properly trained, whether they'll be respected, whether the institution will be ready for them. And if it's not," Thomas looked at her with those steady gray eyes that had seen things he'd never fully described, "then you be so good they can't ignore you. Earn everything twice, and when your moment comes, you seize it without hesitation." That philosophy would carry her further than she could imagine that rainy afternoon. The defining moment came 3 years later when Elena was 17. 3 male classmates, all seniors, all bigger than her by 50 pounds or more, cornered her behind the school gym after a basketball game. They'd been drinking, which made them bold and stupid in equal measure. They thought she was an easy target, a small girl walking alone in the dark. They were very wrong. The first one grabbed her arm. She broke his nose with a palm strike to the face using the technique Thomas had drilled into her 1,000 times. The second one rushed in. She used his momentum, turned her hip, threw him over her leg in a basic Osotogari sweep that sent him hard into the pavement. The third one hesitated, which was his first mistake. His second mistake was thinking he could grab her from behind. She drove her elbow into his solar plexus, hooked his leg, took him down, and had him in an arm lock before he understood what was happening. Thomas found her 5 minutes later standing calm near the 3 boys who were still trying to figure out what had hit them. One was holding his bleeding nose. One was curled up trying to breathe. One was cradling his arm where the joint had been stressed almost to the breaking point. Thomas looked at the scene, looked at his daughter, and said nothing for a long moment. "Come with me," he finally said. They drove in silence to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall on the south side of town. Elena had been there before, dropping off her father for meetings, picking him up after events, but she'd never been inside during one of their gatherings. Thomas led her through the door into the main room where 4 older men sat around a table playing cards. They all looked up when Thomas entered with Elena. There was something in his expression that made them set down their cards without question. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, "my daughter just put 3 grown men on the ground behind her high school, used techniques I taught her. Did it without panic, without hesitation, without losing control. I think it's time you met her properly." The 4 men stood. Elena recognized them from neighborhood gatherings, 4th of July barbecues, the kind of community events where veterans tended to cluster together, speaking their own language of shared experience. Gunnery Sergeant Patrick O'Sullivan, retired, was 68 years old that year. He'd served with the Marines Force Recon deployed to Desert Storm in 1990 when he was 31. He was tall, lean, still moved like a man who could cover ground quickly when needed. His specialty had been marksmanship and small unit tactics. Chief Warrant Officer James Kowalski retired was 66. Army Special Forces 5th Group Desert Storm veteran who'd operated behind enemy lines during the air campaign. He'd been a survival instructor before retirement, the kind of man who could build a shelter from nothing and make fire in a rainstorm. Colonel William Blackwood retired was 70. Marine infantry officer, combat veteran of multiple deployments, tactical planning specialist. He'd been the one making the big decisions while younger men executed them. Age had slowed his body, but not his mind, and Thomas Ravencroft completed the circle. The youngest of them at 59, but carrying the same weight of experience, the same understanding of what war really meant. "You have warrior spirit," Thomas said to Elena in front of these men who knew what that meant. "But spirit without discipline is just violence. Spirit without wisdom is just destruction. These men taught me. Now they'll teach you." For the next 4 years, from age 14 to 18, Elena Ravencroft received an education that wasn't available in any school. 3 afternoons a week plus weekends, she trained with these 4 Gulf War veterans who decided that the next generation of warriors deserved everything they'd learned the hard way. Gunny O'Sullivan taught her to shoot. Not just point and pull the trigger, but the full discipline of marksmanship. Breathing control, trigger squeeze, sight picture, follow through. They'd drive out to private land owned by a friend of his, and she'd spend hours with a .22 rifle learning the fundamentals. Later, when she was older, he'd progress her to pistol, then carbine, then precision rifle. He taught her weapon maintenance, malfunction clearance, the mindset of controlled aggression. Combat shooting isn't about accuracy at leisure. O'Sullivan would say, his Boston accent still strong after decades in Washington. It's about acceptable accuracy under extreme stress. You learn to make the shot that's good enough fast enough when your heart is trying to beat out of your chest and you haven't slept in 2 days. Chief Kowalski taught her survival skills in field medicine. How to navigate without GPS, how to find water, how to build shelter, how to move through terrain without being detected. He taught her trauma care, the kind of practical medicine that kept people alive in the minutes before professional help arrived. Tourniquet application when packing, airway management, the brutal calculus of triage. In Desert Storm, Kowalski told her, "We operated in small teams, sometimes days from support. You had to be able to keep yourself and your team in mind with what you carried. That hasn't changed. Technology gets better, but the fundamentals remain." Colonel Blackwood taught her how to think like a tactician. He'd set up scenarios, force her to make decisions under pressure, critique her reasoning afterward. Attack or defend, move or stay, engage or evade. He taught her to read terrain, to understand fields of fire, to think about second and third order effects. Tactics, Blackwood said, is just problem solving under the worst possible circumstances. You learn to make the least bad decision in a situation where all your options are terrible. That's leadership. And Thomas taught her the physical skills, the hand-to-hand combat that would one day save her life and define her career. Krav Maga formed the foundation, that brutally practical Israeli system designed for soldiers who needed to survive real violence. But he supplemented it with judo, with wrestling, with boxing, building a comprehensive understanding of how to control damage or escape from a larger, stronger opponent. Size matters, Thomas told her 100 times. Strength matters, but leverage matters more. Timing matters more. Understanding your opponent's intentions before they fully form matters most of all. You'll never be the biggest person in the fight, so you become the smartest, the fastest, the most technically precise. The 4 men told her stories from their war, not the sanitized versions they told at public events, but the real stories, the complicated ones that didn't fit neatly into narratives about glory or heroism. They told her about fear, about confusion, about the chaos of combat where nothing goes according to plan. They told her about the weight of responsibility, about losing people you cared about the guilt that follows you home. But they always told her about purpose, about believing in something larger than yourself, about the bonds formed with people who trust you with their lives, about the satisfaction of doing something difficult that truly matters. "We didn't have women in ground combat roles during our time," O'Sullivan said one afternoon when Elena was 16. "Wasn't allowed. But we saw what happened when we couldn't engage with half the population in the places we operated. That was a vulnerability. The enemy used it against us. You're going to be part of fixing that. You think the army is ready? Elena asked. The four men exchanged glances. Blackwood spoke carefully. The army is never ready for change. The army adapts to change after change forces itself upon them. You won't have an easy path. You'll be scrutinized more than men, judged by different standards, held to higher expectations. People will question whether you belong, whether you're qualified, whether standards were lowered to accommodate you. He leaned forward, his old eyes sharp. So you become undeniable. You become so competent, so professional, so technically skilled that the only question becomes why it took so long to let people like you serve. You honor the uniform. You honor your unit. You honor everyone who taught you. And eventually the institution catches up. At 18, Elena Ravencroft enlisted in the United States Army with an 11B contract infantry. Her father drove her to the military entrance processing station in Seattle, and they sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before she went inside. You remember everything we taught you? Thomas asked. Every word. You understand it won't be easy. I'm not looking for easy. Thomas nodded slowly. Your mother would be proud. She would have liked to see this day. Elena's mother had died when she was 10, cancer that moved fast and left no time for goodbyes. Thomas had raised her alone, poured everything he knew into making sure she'd be strong enough for whatever the world threw at her. Be so good they can't ignore you, Thomas said, echoing the words he'd told her 100 times. Earn everything twice, and when your moment comes, seize it. I will. I know you will. Now go show them what the old man taught you. Basic training at Fort Moore was unremarkable. Infantry one-station unit training was easier than expected. Elena didn't stand out, didn't showboat, just consistently performed in the top 10% of every evaluation. She was strong enough, fast enough, skilled enough. The male soldiers in her company mostly ignored her or accepted her. A few made comments. She let it slide. It wasn't time yet. The real test came during her first deployment, March 2020. Elena was 23 years old, assigned to 2nd Battalion 87th Infantry Regiment, deployed to Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. The war was winding down by then, a slow de-escalation that still killed people regularly, but no longer dominated headlines back home. Most combat operations had transitioned to Afghan forces, with American units providing support training and quick reaction capability. Elena was attached to a female engagement team providing security. The FET's mission was straightforward, on paper complex in execution. They moved with infantry units into villages and compounds, but while the men talked to fighting-age males, the FET engaged with women and children. Intelligence collection, medical assessment, relationship building, accessing the half of the population that male soldiers couldn't effectively reach. The team leader was Major Sarah Callahan, 38 years old, 15 years in service, tough as tungsten, and twice as sharp. She'd come up through the enlisted ranks, earned her commission through Green to Gold program, done 3 previous deployments. She had no patience for incompetence and infinite patience for people willing to learn. Callahan spotted something in Elena within the first week. The way she moved, the way she processed information, the calm she maintained under stress. After a particularly long mission, she pulled Elena aside. You've had training beyond what the Army gave you, Callahan said. It wasn't a question. Elena hesitated, then nodded. My father, Force Recon Gulf War. He and some of his veteran friends taught me. Callahan smiled slightly. That explains it. You move like someone who's been taught by people who actually use this stuff in combat, not just instructors running a curriculum. Keep that to yourself, but keep using it. It's keeping you alive. 6 months into the deployment, everything changed. The mission was supposed to be routine. The FET, with Elena's platoon providing outer security, conducted village assessments near the Pakistani border. Simple on paper, talk to women, gather information, build rapport, leave. They'd done it dozens of times. The ambush hit at 0340 hours on a moonless night in March 2021. The team was moving between compounds in a small village, using night vision and thermal optics, 4 vehicles in a loose convoy. The interpreter was in the lead vehicle with Major Callahan. Elena was in the second vehicle with the team medic and 3 infantry soldiers. The first indication was the RPG contrail appearing in Elena's night vision like a bright green streak. It hit the lead vehicle from the right side, detonating against the door, but not penetrating the armor. The explosion was loud enough to feel in your chest, bright enough to white out the night vision for a second. Then the small arms fire opened up from two positions. PKM machine guns, the distinctive sound of 7.62 by 39 multi-beater rounds snapping through the air. The interpreter in the lead vehicle took a round through an open window, through the throat, killed instantly. Major Callahan was in the process of dismounting when the second RPG hit this one, detonating close enough to send fragmentation through her left leg, tearing open her femoral artery. The convoy came to a disorganized halt. The infantry soldiers began returning fire. The team medic tried to move forward to reach Callahan, but was pinned behind a compound wall by machine gun fire from two directions, rounds chewing up the mud brick and kicking up dust that made it impossible to see. Elena was fourth in line, 40 meters from the lead vehicle. She could see Callahan on the ground, see the arterial spray, even in the greenwash of night vision. Understood instantly that without intervention in the next 2 minutes, Major Callahan would bleed out and die. The training from her father, from Gunny O'Sullivan, from Chief Kowalski, from 100 hours of stress inoculation, all of it activated without conscious thought. She moved. Low crawl using the irrigation ditch that ran parallel to the dirt road, M4 carbine across her forearms, body as flat as possible. Incoming fire snapped overhead, close enough to hear the supersonic crack. The ditch was 6 inches deep, barely enough concealment, but it was what she had. 40 meters of open ground under fire, moving during the pauses when the machine gun shifted to engage other targets, freezing when it swung back. It took 90 seconds that felt like hours. She reached Major Callahan, saw the wound, the blood soaking into the dirt. The Major's eyes wide and conscious, already going into shock. Elena rolled to her side, pulled a cat tourniquet from her kit, worked it around Callahan's left thigh above the wound site, tightened it one-handed while staying prone. "Stay with me, ma'am," Elena said, her voice steady despite everything. "You taught me never quit. Don't you quit on me now." The machine gun fire found them. Rounds impacted close, kicking up dirt. Elena rolled partially over Callahan's body, shielding her with her own mass, brought her M4 up with her right hand, and began returning fire. She couldn't see the enemy position clearly, was firing based on muzzle flash and sound, but the principle was suppression. Make them keep their heads down. Buy time. She burned through a 30-round magazine in controlled bursts. Reloaded. Burned through another. Her left hand stayed pressed on Callahan's wound, maintaining pressure, even though the tourniquet was doing most of the work. She could feel Callahan's heartbeat rapid and thready, feel her trying to say something. "Save it, ma'am. Stay quiet. Breathe steady. Medevac is coming." Second magazine gone. Third magazine, her last, feeding into the rifle. Elena had never been more aware of every sense. The smell of copper from blood, the smell of burning propellant from her weapon, the sound of rounds cracking past the deeper boom of friendlies engaging with heavier weapons, the texture of dirt under her body, the weight of Callahan's gear, the specific tension in the cat tourniquet's windlass. Time became strange. Everything happened very fast and very slow simultaneously. Air support arrived 9 minutes after the initial contact. Apache helicopters, their chain guns turning the ambush positions into dust and fire. The firing stopped. The team medic reached them 90 seconds later, took over treatment, started IV fluids. Medevac helicopter landed 6 minutes after that. They loaded Callahan, still conscious, eyes locked on Elena's face. The interpreter didn't survive. His body was recovered, handled with respect, prepared for a return home. Major Callahan survived the helicopter ride to Bagram by 90 seconds. The field surgeon later wrote in his report that without the tourniquet application and sustained pressure under fire, she would have bled out in under 3 minutes. Elena's actions had bought enough time for professional medical intervention to work. 3 days later, Elena stood in the hospital at Bagram Air Base, looking at Major Callahan in the ICU, tubes and monitors, and the steady beep of machines tracking her vitals. The Major was barely conscious, but her eyes found Elena's face. Her hand moved weakly, grabbed Elena's wrist. "They're coming for you," Callahan whispered, voice rough from intubation. "Special program, women operators. Say yes. That's an order, Ravencroft. Ma'am, you need to rest. Promise me. Say yes." "I promise." Callahan's grip relaxed. She closed her eyes. She died that night from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that broke loose and traveled to her lungs. The wound had been survivable. The complications killed her anyway. War doesn't care about fairness. Elena stood at the memorial service wearing her dress uniform, holding herself together through discipline and training. Callahan's personal effects were shipped home to family in Tennessee. Among them were 2 sets of dog tags, the one she wore and a spare set she kept with her gear. After the service, a woman approached Elena, tall, lean, early 50s, wearing civilian clothes but moving like military. She had the look of someone who'd spent a lot of time in places that didn't appear on regular maps. "Sergeant Ravencroft," the woman said. "Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Voss, Special Activities Division. Can we talk somewhere private?" They walked to an empty maintenance bay far from listening ears. "Major Callahan sent me a message 6 hours before she died," Voss said without preamble. "She said I needed to talk to you, said you were exactly what we were looking for." "For what, ma'am?" "A program, classified, training female soldiers for missions requiring cultural access in denied areas. Not officially special operations, but using their methods, their standards, their instructors." Elena said nothing, waiting. 12 slots, 48 applicants. Selection standards equivalent to Special Forces assessment. Training conducted by Tier 1 instructors. Israeli Krav Maga specialists, Delta Force close quarters, battle experts. Ranger qualified, medical personnel. 8 months Fort Bragg at a compound that doesn't exist on any official map. Ime Voss paused, reading Elena's expression. "You'll become invisible until necessary, undeniable when revealed. You'll do missions that can't be acknowledged. If you're caught, we don't know you. If you die, your family gets a letter about a training accident." Elena pulled out the spare dog tags she'd been carrying, the ones from Major Callahan's personal effects that someone had quietly given her. She held them up. "What would I be doing exactly? Things that matter, things that save lives, things male soldiers can't do because of who they are. You saw it yourself, half the population we couldn't access. That's changing. You'd be part of that change?" Elena looked at the dog tags, thought about her father, about the 4 veterans who trained her, about Callahan's last words. "When do I start?" Voss smiled slightly, reached up and pulled back her right sleeve just enough to show a small tattoo on her inner wrist. A dragon stylized no bigger than a quarter. "Welcome to the Sisterhood, Sergeant Ravencroft. Welcome to Operation Sphinx." And that's where the real story began. The compound at Fort Bragg didn't appear on any official map. No signs marked the turnoff from the main road, just a gap in the tree line and a dirt track that wound through North Carolina pine forest for 2 miles before reaching a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The guards at the gate wore no unit patches, no name tapes, just blank fatigues and weapons held with the casual competence of people who knew how to use them. Elena arrived on a gray morning in May 2021, 1 month after Major Callahan's death, sitting in the back of an unmarked van with 5 other women. Nobody spoke during the drive. They'd all received the same instructions: pack light, tell no one. Prepare for 8 months of training that officially didn't exist. The compound itself was spare and functional. Barracks built from concrete blocks, a medical facility, a kill house for close quarters, combat training, an obstacle course that looked like it had been designed by someone with a sadistic imagination, and a classroom building where the windows were covered with blackout material. 48 women stood in formation that first morning, ages ranging from 22 to 34, drawn from combat MOSs across the Army. Infantry, military, police, intelligence specialists, medics. They'd all volunteered. They'd all passed preliminary screening. Most of them wouldn't finish. Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Voss stood before them in running gear, her dragon tattoo visible on her right wrist. She was 54 years old, had spent 26 years in service, doing things she'd never be able to talk about publicly, and she looked at the formation with the expression of someone evaluating raw material for a difficult project. "Operation Sphinx," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "exists to create a capability the United States military currently lacks. Female operators who can access denied environments, conduct intelligence collection, perform direct action missions in contexts where male soldiers cannot effectively operate." She paused. Let that sink in. "The selection standards are equivalent to Special Forces assessment. The training pipeline uses Tier 1 instructors and methodologies. Approximately 25% of you will graduate. The rest will return to your units with no record of being here, no explanation beyond temporary duty reassignment. This program is classified. If you discuss it outside authorized channels, you will face criminal prosecution. If you fail, you will forget this place exists. If you quit, same result. Questions? Nobody raised a hand. Voss smiled slightly. Good. Week 1 begins now. Run. On the first 2 weeks were designed to break people. Not physically, though the physical component was brutal. 12-mile ruck marches with 65-pound packs in under 3 hours. Obstacle courses run until muscle failure. Combat fitness assessments that pushed everyone past what they thought were their limits. But the real pressure was psychological. Sleep deprivation, constant evaluation, the grinding awareness that every mistake was being recorded, every weakness identified. 15 women quit in week 1. They simply decided the cost wasn't worth the reward, walked into the administrative building, and signed the paperwork that would send them back to their previous assignments. No judgment, no shame, just a recognition that this particular path wasn't for them. 9 more were cut in week 2, not because they quit, but because the cadre determined they didn't have the right combination of attributes. Too slow to adapt, too rigid in their thinking, unable to handle ambiguity. Good soldiers just not right for this specific mission set. Elena survived those first weeks by remembering everything her father and his friends had taught her. When the ruck march felt impossible, she heard Gunny O'Sullivan's voice. Pain is just information. Note it and move on. When the sleep deprivation made her want to quit, she remembered Chief Kowalski. Fatigue makes cowards of us all. The warrior acknowledges the fatigue and performs anyway. When the evaluators pushed her to make decisions under pressure, she heard Colonel Blackwood, perfect information doesn't exist. Make the least bad decision with what you have. By week 4, 24 women remained. The cadre shifted from breaking people to building them. The Israeli instructor arrived in week 5. He was short, compact, maybe 40 years old with scars on his hands, in a manner that suggested he'd seen more combat than he'd ever discuss. He'd served with Sayeret Matkal, Israel's premier special operations unit, and he taught Krav Maga not as a martial art, but as a survival system. Fighting is not sport, he said on the first day, his accent thick, but his English clear. Fighting is chaos. Fighting is when someone is trying to kill you, and you must kill them first or die. Everything I teach you is about that moment. Forget fair, forget rules. Survive by any means necessary. The training was brutal and practical. Eye strikes, throat strikes, groin attacks, joint destructions. How to fight from inferior positions. How to access weapons when you're being controlled. How to create space when someone larger is trying to crush you. How to transition from empty hand to knife to gun in a single fluid movement. Elena absorbed it like a sponge. Her father had taught her the fundamentals, but this was the advanced course taught by someone who'd used these techniques in actual combat. She practiced until the movements became automatic, until she could execute them. Exhausted, injured under stress in the dark. The instructor noticed. After a particularly intense session, he pulled her aside. You've trained before, he said. Not army training, something else. My father, Gulf War veteran, he and his friends taught me. The instructor nodded slowly. They taught you well. You have foundation. Now we build the house. He tapped his temple. But remember, the best fight is the one you don't have. Be invisible. When you must be seen, be undeniable. Week 8 brought SARE training, survival, evasion, resistance, escape. The practical skills of staying in hostile territory and resisting interrogation if captured. They were driven into the woods with minimal equipment, given a grid coordinate 40 miles away, and told to reach it within 72 hours, while a hunter force tried to capture them. Elena partnered with a woman named Lieutenant Jessica Torres, 29 years old, intelligence specialist with 2 previous deployments. They moved through the North Carolina wilderness using techniques Chief Kowalski had drilled into Elena years earlier. They avoided trails, moved at night, used terrain for concealment. They reached the extraction point in 68 hours. Then came the resistance phase. Captured, hooded, placed in stress positions, subjected to sleep deprivation, and simulated interrogation. The point wasn't to teach them to resist forever. Nobody could. The point was to teach them how to buy time, how to manage information, how to protect critical intelligence, even under extreme duress. Elena broke on hour 68, gave up false information, fed them a cover story that sounded plausible. The interrogator smiled and released her. In the debrief, the instructor explained she'd held longer than most Delta Force operators in the same scenario. But remember this feeling, he said, the helplessness, the fear, the knowledge that you told them things you didn't want to tell them. Remember it and do everything in your power to never be captured for real. 8 more women quit during SEER Week. The psychological pressure was too much. They'd volunteered for challenge, not torture. No one blamed them. Week 12 brought trauma medicine, taught by Ranger-qualified physician assistants who'd done multiple combat deployments. The training went far beyond standard combat lifesaver certification. Surgical cricothyrotomy, creating an emergency airway when someone's throat was crushed. Needle decompression for tension. Pneumothorax when air trapped in the chest cavity was crushing the lungs. Hemorrhage control for wounds that regular tourniquets couldn't address. They practiced on pig cadavers on high-fidelity mannequins that bled realistic blood, and eventually on each other under controlled circumstances, actually performing procedures up to the point where real damage would occur. The training was designed to remove hesitation. In combat, hesitation killed people. They needed to be able to cut into human flesh without freezing to make life or death medical decisions in seconds. Elena's hands never shook. The instructors noticed. Her background that night in Afghanistan with Major Callahan had prepared her for this in ways most of the other students hadn't experienced. 4 more women were cut during medical training, not because they couldn't learn the procedures, but because they couldn't perform them under stress. In the simulations where explosions were detonating, instructors were yelling, and multiple casualties needed treatment simultaneously, they froze. Good people, but not ready for this level of intensity. By week 16, 12 women remained. The cadre announced they'd survived selection. Now came the actual training. Delta Force instructors taught close quarters battle, room clearing with live ammunition, multiple shooters moving through structures, making split-second decisions about threats. They learned to transition seamlessly from rifle to pistol to shoot while moving to engage targets in confined spaces where one mistake could kill a teammate. The training was conducted in the Kill House, a modular facility that could be reconfigured into different layouts. At first, they used simulation ammunition. Then they progressed to live fire with role players acting as hostages and threats. The stress was immense. The learning curve was steep. But gradually, over hundreds of repetitions, the skills became ingrained. Elena's background with the Gunny O'Sullivan gave her an advantage. She already understood marksmanship fundamentals, already knew how to manage a weapon under stress. Now she was learning to apply those skills in 3-dimensional environments with teammates depending on her judgment. Cultural operations training came from instructors who'd spent years working in denied areas. They taught the nuances of engaging with populations that didn't trust Americans, didn't trust outsiders, didn't trust women in non-traditional roles. How to build rapport. How to ask questions that didn't sound like interrogation. How to observe and gather intelligence while appearing to do something completely different. Your gender is your advantage, one instructor said. In most traditional cultures, women talk to women about things they'd never discuss with men. You can access information that male operators cannot. But you must be culturally competent. You must understand the local context. You must build genuine relationships, not just extract intelligence. The training included language basics for multiple regions, understanding of religious and cultural practices, and practical skills like how to dress appropriately, how to navigate social structures, how to recognize when you're being tested or deceived. Week 24 brought the integrated training exercise, a 72-hour field problem that combined everything they'd learned. Navigate to multiple objectives, conduct reconnaissance, perform a direct action mission in the kill house, provide trauma care to simulated casualties, evade a hunter force, extract to a designated point. Elena's partner was Jessica Torres. They'd trained together since week 8, developed an understanding that came from shared hardship. The exercise began at midnight on a cold October night. They were given minimal equipment, a series of grid coordinates and instructions that were deliberately vague. For 68 hours, everything went according to plan. They navigated successfully. They gathered the required intelligence. They executed the direct action mission in the kill house, flawlessly cleared 4 rooms, neutralized 6 threats, extracted a hostage role player without injury. Then, at hour 68, Jessica landed wrong coming off a rope obstacle and broke her ankle. The sound was audible, a crack that made Elena's stomach drop. Jessica went down, couldn't put weight on the leg, face pale with pain. They were 8 miles from the extraction point. The hunter force was between them and the objective. The rules allowed for calling a safety abort, but that meant automatic failure of the exercise. Elena looked at Jessica. Jessica looked back. "Leave me," Jessica said. "Complete the mission." "Not happening." "That's an order, Sergeant." "With respect, ma'am, I'm not leaving you. We finish together or we don't finish." Elena fashioned a splint from branches and paracord, gave Jessica an improvised crutch, and then simply picked her up in a fireman's carry. 135 pounds of soldier, plus gear, plus weapons. She settled the weight across her shoulders and started moving. 8 miles through North Carolina forest in the dark, carrying a casualty, evading a hunter force that had thermal optics in superior numbers. Elena drew on everything Chief Kowalski had taught her about land navigation and movement. She used terrain for concealment, moved during the hunter force's shift changes when they were less alert, paused when Jessica needed to catch her breath. They reached the extraction point at hour 90, 20 minutes before the deadline. Elena set Jessica down gently and they both collapsed. The evaluators found them there, exhausted beyond description, but mission complete. The lead instructor, a grizzled Special Forces sergeant major with 28 years in service, looked at them and shook his head slowly. "First time anyone's completed this exercise, carrying a casualty the full distance," he said. "Most people call the safety abort. Some people leave their partner and complete solo. Nobody carries someone 8 miles and makes the timeline." He extended his hand to Elena. She shook it, too tired to speak. "You've got something special, Ravencroft. Don't ever lose it." Week 32, graduation day. 12 women stood in formation, 12 out of the original 48 who'd started. They'd survived selection, completed training, proven they belonged. They represented something the American military had never had before, a cadre of female operators trained to the same standard as Special Operations Forces. The ceremony was private. No cameras, no press, no official record. Just the 12 graduates, the cadre who'd trained them, and a handful of senior officers who'd supported the program from the shadows. Lieutenant Colonel Voss gave a short speech. "You are weapons the enemy will never see coming, invisible until necessary, undeniable when revealed. You don't exist on paper, but you exist where it matters, in the dark places where this country needs you most. You will do missions that cannot be acknowledged. You will face dangers that won't be recognized. You will save lives that will never know you saved them. That is the burden you have chosen to carry. I'm honored to serve with you." Then came the tattoo ceremony. One by one, each woman received the small dragon mark on her inner right wrist, the symbol of Artemis, goddess of the hunt, protector of women. Small enough to be discreet, permanent enough to last forever. A mark of completion, of capability, of belonging to something that officially didn't exist. Elena sat in the chair and watched the tattoo artist work. The needle stung, but she barely noticed. When it was done, she looked at the small dragon on her wrist and felt something shift inside her. She was no longer just Elena Ravencroft, infantry soldier. She was something more, something harder to define but impossible to deny. The sisterhood, the 12 who'd survived. They didn't all like each other, didn't all agree on everything, but they shared something that no one else could understand. They'd been through fire together, literally and metaphorically, and come out forged into something new. The missions began immediately. They were split into teams and deployed to different theaters. Elena found herself back in Afghanistan for 6 months, then Syria for 4 months, then Yemen for 3 months. The work was exactly what they'd trained for, accessing populations. Male soldiers couldn't reach, gathering intelligence through relationships. Male operators couldn't build, providing medical care that opened doors conventional forces couldn't open. She worked village operations in Afghanistan, building networks of women who provided information about Taliban movements. She conducted medical support missions in Syria, treating children in areas where any American military presence was officially denied. She tracked high-value targets in Yemen by developing relationships with their family members, particularly the women who knew everything but told male interrogators nothing. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and absolutely essential. Elena saw the impact directly. Intelligence she gathered led to the capture of 3 Taliban commanders. Medical care she provided saved dozens of civilian lives and built goodwill that made populations more willing to cooperate with coalition forces. Relationships she developed provided early warning about attacks that saved American lives. She was good at it, better than good. Her natural empathy combined with her technical training created something powerful. She could project strength when needed and vulnerability when appropriate. She could read people, understand their motivations, build genuine connections even across vast cultural differences. But the program had enemies, people in Congress who questioned the cost, people in the military who thought it undermined traditional standards, people who simply didn't believe women belonged in these roles regardless of their performance. The political pressure built slowly, then suddenly, a congressional oversight committee began asking questions about classified programs and black budget spending. A senator demanded detailed accounting for every dollar spent on unauthorized gender integration programs. The Pentagon, facing budget cuts and political headwinds, made the calculation that Operation Sphinx was too controversial to defend publicly and too classified to defend effectively. In October 2022, the order came down. Operation Sphinx was officially dissolved. All 12 graduates would be reassigned to conventional units. Service records would be sanitized with the 14 months of Sphinx training marked simply as training, specialized program. All mission files would be destroyed. The compound at Fort Bragg would be repurposed. For official purposes, Operation Sphinx had never existed. The 12 women were scattered across the military, given conventional assignments, told to resume normal careers. The training remained, the skills remained, the knowledge remained, but the institutional support vanished overnight. Elena took it hard, not the dissolution itself, but what it represented. The acknowledgement that politics mattered more than capability, that perception mattered more than performance. They'd proven the concept worked. They'd conducted successful missions. They'd done exactly what the program was designed to do, and none of it mattered because someone in Washington had decided it was politically inconvenient. But the worst moment came in Mosul during what was supposed to be her final mission before reassignment. The mission was supporting a Delta Force hostage rescue operation. American aid workers held by ISIS remnants intelligence indicated they were being moved, window of opportunity closing fast. Elena's element was providing outer security and preparing to conduct immediate medical treatment on freed hostages. The breach went perfectly. Delta assaulters hit the compound at 0300 hours, cleared it in 90 seconds, secured the hostages. Elena's element moved forward to begin casualty care. That's when the secondary IED detonated. It was command wire initiated, someone watching from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment. The explosion hit one of the up-armored vehicles in Elena's element, the blast powerful enough to flip it, the secondary fragmentation turning the interior into a kill zone. Elena was 20 meters away when it happened. She ran toward the burning vehicle without thinking, pulled open the damaged door, started dragging people out. The first 2 were injured but alive. The third was Lieutenant Jessica Torres, her partner from training her friend from 100 missions. Jessica was still alive when Elena got her out of the vehicle, but the injuries were catastrophic. Fragmentation through the torso, internal bleeding that no field medicine could address. Elena knew it immediately, had seen enough combat casualties to recognize unsurvivable wounds. She held Jessica anyway. It applied pressure to wounds that were bleeding too fast, called for medevac that would arrive too late. Jessica looked up at her, blood on her lips, recognition in her eyes. "Tell my daughter," Jessica said, voice barely a whisper. "Tell her I was doing something important. You're going to tell her yourself. Stay with me. Tell her I loved her. Tell her I died doing something that mattered." Jessica's eyes lost focus. Her breathing stopped. Elena felt the moment her heart stopped beating, that terrible stillness that separated the living from the dead. She sat there holding Jessica's body until the medics physically pulled her away. At the memorial service, Elena stood in her dress uniform and received Jessica's spare dog tags from the unit commander. 2 sets now, Major Callahan's from Afghanistan, Lieutenant Torres's from Iraq. She kept them both in a small wooden box, carried them everywhere. Reminders of the cost of this work. When the orders came through reassigning her to conventional duty, Elena called her father. Thomas Ravencroft was 71 years old now, still living in Seattle, still sharp despite the years. They're shutting down the program, Elena said, pretending it never existed. But you existed. You did the work. They can't take that from you. Feels like they're trying to. Then you find another way to use what you learned. The institution fails all the time. Individual warriors still have purpose. Find yours. Elena thought about that for a long time. Find purpose. Use what she'd learned. Teach the next generation. Eventually, the path became clear. She volunteered for the Modern Army Combatives Level 4 instructor course at Fort Moore, not running from her past, weaponizing it. If the Army wouldn't let her operate anymore, she'd teach others to operate. If Sphinx couldn't exist officially, its knowledge would survive through the people she trained. The paperwork went through. Orders to Fort Moore, Georgia, 8-month course. If she graduated, she'd be qualified to teach the Army's highest level of hand-to-hand combat to instructors across the force. She arrived in September 2024, 28 years old, carrying 2 sets of dog tags and a dragon tattoo that told a story no one would believe. What she didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Jake Brennan had been at Fort Moore for 6 months working as an assistant instructor, and he'd already decided she didn't belong before he ever met her. What she didn't know was that Command Sergeant Major Frank Garrison had just arrived at the installation with a vendetta against programs like Sphinx and a willingness to use soldiers like Brennan as weapons. What she didn't know was that Command Sergeant Major Raymond Thorne had been watching her file with interest, making quiet inquiries, trying to understand what those classification markers really meant. The stage was being set. The players were moving into position. And in 72 hours, everything would come to a head in a training ring where 3 men would try to prove she didn't belong, and she would teach them a lesson about underestimating warriors and who'd earned their place in the hardest possible way. But first, there were 3 weeks of watching, evaluating, and preparing. Specialist Derek Maddox approached her after the second day of training. He was 24 Infantry 2nd Deployment veteran, and he moved with the careful awareness of someone who'd seen combat. He waited until they were alone near the equipment shed. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "my uncle served Force Recon during Gulf War. He told me stories about experimental programs. Women trained for specialized operations. Said they had a marking, a dragon tattoo." Elena looked at him carefully, evaluating whether this was a threat or an opportunity. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Brennan and his crew are planning something. I've heard them talking. They think you don't belong here, think you're proof of lowered standards. They're going to try to prove it publicly. And you're warning me why Maddox met her eyes. Because my uncle said those programs were necessary. Said women could go places men couldn't do, things men couldn't do. Said the military was better for having them, even if people didn't want to admit it. If you're one of them, you deserve better than what Brennan's planning." Elena was quiet for a moment, then slowly rolled up her right sleeve, showing the small dragon tattoo. Maddox nodded slowly, something like awe in his expression. "I knew it. My uncle was right. This conversation doesn't leave here." "Understood, ma'am, but be careful. Brennan has friends. Command Sergeant Major Garrison just arrived, and he's been encouraging this whole thing. They're setting you up. Let them." "Ma'am, let them set it up. Sometimes the only way to teach a lesson is to let people learn it the hard way." "I appreciate the warning, specialist, but I can handle Brennan." What Elena didn't say was that she'd already identified Brennan as a threat on day 1. She'd watched him, studied his movement patterns, noted the old shoulder injury that made him favor his right side, cataloged his techniques and tendencies. She'd done the same with Dalton and Westbrook. She'd run through scenarios in her mind, planned responses, prepared for a confrontation. Because that's what Sphinx had taught her. That's what her father had taught her. That's what 4 Gulf War veterans had drilled into her when she was a teenager in a garage in Seattle. Be ready, be prepared. When the moment comes, execute without hesitation. Command Sergeant Major Thorne watched Elena teach a class on day 10 and saw something that confirmed his suspicions. The way she moved, the way she broke down techniques, the precision of her demonstrations. This wasn't someone who'd learned combatives from Army instructors. This was someone who'd been trained by people who'd used these skills in actual combat in contexts where mistakes meant death. After class, he made a phone call to an old friend, a retired Special Forces colonel he'd served with in Iraq. "I've got a captain in my instructor course," Thorne said. Service record shows 14 months of classified training. Classification markers I've never seen before. She moves like your guys, teaches like your guys. What am I dealing with here? The colonel was quiet for a long moment. Ray, I can't talk about specific programs, but if you've got a soldier with that kind of background, my advice is simple. Trust her, protect her if you can, and for God's sake, don't underestimate her. That's what I thought. Thanks. Thorne hung up and made a decision. Whatever Brennan was planning, whatever Garrison was encouraging, he would allow it to proceed to a point, but he would maintain control. He would be the safety officer. He would ensure it didn't go too far. And if Elena was who he thought she was, she'd handle herself just fine. On day 12, Brennan filed his formal complaint. Elena was teaching unauthorized techniques, creating safety risks. Her presence was a distraction and a liability. The complaint was detailed, professional-looking, and completely calculated to force a response. Thorne investigated, reviewed the techniques Elena taught, compared them to doctrinal standards. Everything she taught was within parameters. Some of it was more advanced than standard curriculum, but it wasn't unauthorized. She was making other instructors look less capable by comparison, and that was the real complaint. He told Brennan the complaint was unfounded. Brennan's face went red. 2 days later, the proposal came through official channels. A 3-on-1 demonstration match. Training evolution focused on defensive tactics under numerical disadvantage. Brennan, Dalton, and Westbrook against Elena. Controlled techniques, immediate stop on taps, Thorne as primary safety officer. Thorne should have denied it immediately, should have recognized it for what it was, shut it down, protected Elena from institutional harassment. But Command Sergeant Major Garrison had already coordinated with the brigade commander who thought it was a legitimate training evolution. And Thorne was 62 8 months from retirement, in no position to fight battles with senior leadership. So he approved it with conditions. Strict safety protocols, his authority to halt the match at any time, medical personnel standing by, and he made sure Elena understood what she was walking into. "Captain," he said, pulling her aside, "you don't have to do this. This is Brennan trying to embarrass you publicly. I can still shut it down." Elena looked at him with those calm eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine. "Sergeant Major, with respect, you can't shut this down." "Not really. Even if you stop this specific match, the attitude remains. The belief that I don't belong, that standards were lowered, that my presence undermines the institution. This isn't about one training evolution. It's about a lesson that needs to be taught. And you're confident you can teach that lesson. I was trained by people who fought in your war, Sergeant Major. By people who understood that competence has no gender requirement. By an institution that doesn't officially exist anymore, but whose standards were higher than anything in the conventional military. Brennan doesn't know what he's challenging, but he's about to learn." Thorne studied her face and saw absolute certainty. "All right, Captain. We'll do this, but I'm keeping it controlled, and if he crosses a line, I'm pulling him out regardless of politics." Fair enough. That evening, Elena called her father. Thomas Ravencroft answered on the second ring, his voice still strong despite being 71 years old. "Dad? Elena, I can hear it in your voice. What's happening?" She explained the situation. 3-on-1, public demonstration. Setup designed to humiliate her. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You worried?" "No." "Then why call?" "Because if something goes wrong, I wanted you to know I was thinking about everything you taught me. You and Gunny and Chief and the Colonel. All of it matters. All of it prepared me for this. Nothing will go wrong. You're too good." But Elena, remember what this is really about. It's not about proving you're better than them. It's about teaching them that warriors come in all forms. That competence can't be measured by sex or gender. That the old ways, the fundamental skills we taught you, they still matter. Show them that. Make us proud. "I will, Dad." "I know you will. Now go get some rest. Tomorrow you teach a lesson that those boys will remember for the rest of their lives." Elena hung up and sat in her barracks room door, open to catch the evening breeze. She cleaned her boots with the methodical care her father had taught her 30 years ago. She held the 2 sets of dog tags, Callahan's and Torres's, and thought about the women who'd believed in her, who'd trained her, who'd died believing this work mattered. She thought about the 11 other Sphinx graduates scattered across the military carrying the same mark, The same skills, the same burden of being too capable to be believed, but too classified to be acknowledged. She touched the dragon tattoo on her wrist, that permanent reminder of what she'd survived, what she'd learned, what she'd become. Tomorrow, three men would try to prove she didn't belong. Tomorrow, she would prove them wrong in a way they'd never forget. Tomorrow, the dragon would show its teeth, and everyone watching would understand that underestimating warriors based on their appearance was the fastest way to learn a very hard lesson. Elena lay back on her bunk and closed her eyes. Her breathing was controlled deep and steady, the kind of breath control they drilled into her during SEER training. She wasn't angry. Anger was inefficient, a waste of cognitive resources. She was simply ready, ready to honor her training, ready to teach her lesson, ready to prove that the dragon's mark meant something even if the program that created it had been erased from official records. The sisterhood endured, the skills endured, the legacy endured, and tomorrow everyone at Fort Moore would understand why. The formation gathered at 1400 hours, the hottest part of the Georgia afternoon. Word had spread through the company like wildfire through dry brush. Soldiers who had no official reason to be there found excuses to walk past the training area, to lean against the fence, to position themselves where they could watch. By the time the participants arrived, more than 60 people had gathered, sitting in the weathered bleachers or standing in clusters near the railroad tie perimeter. Command Sergeant Major Raymond Thorne stood at the ring's edge, whistle around his neck, face carefully neutral. He'd been doing this job for 40 years, had seen every kind of soldier, every kind of situation. This one made him deeply uncomfortable, but he'd made his decision. He would allow it to proceed under strict control, and he would be ready to intervene the instant it went wrong. What Thorne didn't know was that 200 meters away in his office overlooking the training complex, Brigadier General Marcus Ashford was watching through binoculars. Ashford was 65 years old, a Special Forces legend with combat deployments spanning 3 decades. He'd been observing the situation for 3 weeks, ever since an old friend at the Pentagon had called to tell him one of the Sphinx graduates was at Fort Moore and facing institutional resistance. Ashford had fought to keep Operation Sphinx alive during the political battle that ultimately killed it. He'd lost that fight, but he'd made damn sure the 12 graduates were protected when they scattered back to conventional assignments. Now one of them was being set up for public humiliation, and he intended to see how she handled it before deciding whether to intervene. Staff Sergeant Jake Brennan entered the ring first, flanked by Sergeant Craig Dalton and Specialist Tyler Westbrook. They'd coordinated their appearance, all three wearing identical PT shirts, identical expressions of grim determination. Brennan rolled his neck, shook out his arms, looked at the gathering crowd like a gladiator entering the arena. His confidence was absolute. He was 6'2", 220 pounds, Ranger qualified, with years of combatives training. He was facing a woman 8 inches shorter and 90 pounds lighter. In his mind, the outcome was predetermined. This was just about making the lesson public. Dalton bounced on his toes, feeding off Brennan's energy mirrors to his friend's aggression. Westbrook tried to look confident, but his eyes kept darting to the spectators, to Thorne, to the medical personnel standing ready. He was 22 years old and beginning to understand he'd been swept up in something larger than he'd realized. Elena Ravencroft walked in alone. No ceremony, no posturing, no dramatic entrance. She simply stepped over the railroad tie boundary and moved to the center of the ring, settling into a neutral stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, hands loose at her sides, weight centered and balanced. Her face was empty of expression, not blank but calm, the kind of calm that came from absolute preparation, meeting absolute confidence. She wore standard PT gear, nothing special, nothing that would give advantage or disadvantage. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun. The dragon tattoo on her inner right wrist was barely visible, just a hint of ink that most spectators wouldn't notice. She touched it once briefly, a gesture so small that only someone watching closely would see it. Then her hands returned to her sides, and she waited. Thorne stepped to the center of the ring, positioned himself where he could see all 4 participants, and went over the rules one final time. His voice carried clearly across the training area, no microphone needed. This is a controlled training evolution. All techniques must maintain partner safety. Tap verbal submission, or my whistle means immediate stop. Any soldier who fails to comply will be removed from this course and face disciplinary action under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Medical personnel are standing by. I have authority to halt this match at any time for any reason. Are these rules understood? His eyes lingered on Brennan when he said it. Brennan nodded, jaw set, barely containing his eagerness. Thorne looked at Elena. She gave a single nod, economical and precise. The whistle blew. Brennan came in fast, trying to use his size to overwhelm Elena in the opening seconds. He shot for a double-leg takedown, the fundamental wrestling technique, head down and driving forward with all his weight, arms reaching to grab both her legs and drive her to the ground. Elena pivoted 45 degrees to her right, minimal movement, just enough. His momentum carried him past her into empty air, where she'd been standing a fraction of a second earlier. Before he could recover his balance, before he could reset, Elena was already moving. She controlled his back, threading one arm under his near armpit, while her other hand gripped his belt, using his own forward pressure against him. She took him down to the mat with technique that looked effortless, looked simple, looked like something anyone could do. The spectators who knew combatives understood immediately what they were seeing. That wasn't luck. That was timing refined through thousands of repetitions, reading an opponent's intention before they fully committed, using their own aggression as the weapon against them. Elena released Brennan immediately, not from kindness, but from tactics. She rolled away and rose to her feet as Dalton rushed in from her left side. He threw a wide hook punch, telegraphing the movement with his shoulders, committing his weight too early. Elena slipped inside his reach, making herself smaller, and executed an Osotogari sweep, major outer reap, her right leg hooking behind his left while her hands controlled his upper body. Dalton hit the ground hard enough that the impact drove air from his lungs in a grunt that carried across the training area. Westbrook came from her right, trying to time his attack while she was focused on Dalton. He attempted a body lock, arms reaching to wrap around her torso and use his size advantage. Elena felt his approach through peripheral vision, that awareness they'd trained into her during Sphinx, understanding space and movement without needing to look directly. She dropped her level, suddenly changing her height, slipping under his arms. Then she drove her shoulder into his abdomen just below the rib cage, a targeted strike that disrupted his breathing and his balance. Westbrook stumbled backward, coughing, trying to recover. Brennan was up again, angrier now, breathing harder. The easy victory he'd expected hadn't materialized. He came in with more caution this time, trying to use his wrestling base properly. He set up a collar tie hand behind Elena's neck, the other controlling her arm, and started to drive forward with his weight advantage. For 3 seconds, it looked like it might work. He was moving her backward, using his mass, his strength, everything he'd been taught about controlling opponents. Then Elena turned her head sharply, a small movement that disrupted his grip. Structure broke his hand position. She used his forward pressure, that fundamental principle her father had taught her 1,000 times, and executed a lateral drop. She took him to the ground while maintaining top position, landing with her weight distributed perfectly, her knees settling across his chest. Her hands controlled his right arm in a Kimura grip, that figure 4 lock on the shoulder joint that could easily dislocate if pressure was applied. She didn't crank it. She just held the position, demonstrating control, showing everyone watching that she could finish the submission, but was choosing not to. The message was clear as spoken words. I could end this. I'm being merciful. Brennan should have tapped. Pride and anger stopped him. Instead, he tried to explode out of the position, using raw strength to bridge, lifting his hips violently to throw her off. It was exactly the wrong response against someone with Elena's level of technical skill. She rode the movement like an ocean wave, smooth and fluid, transitioned seamlessly to his back. Her legs sank hooks, one inside his left thigh, one inside his right, controlling his hips. Her arms slid under his chin into rear naked choke position, forearm across his throat, her other hand grabbing her own bicep to lock the structure. She held it there without squeezing, without applying pressure, just positioning. The threat was implicit. One squeeze and blood flow to his brain would stop. He'd have seconds before unconsciousness. She had complete control, and everyone watching knew it. Thorne stepped forward, ready to call the match, but Elena released before Brennan could tap, before the intervention became necessary. She rolled away, came to her feet, and reset to neutral position. Brennan remained on his hands and knees for a moment, breathing hard, the first real doubt appearing in his eyes. The pattern repeated for 2.5 minutes that felt much longer to everyone watching. 3 men attacking with increasing desperation, using their size, their strength, their numerical advantage, everything they had, and Elena moving through them like water through rocks, always a half second ahead of where they thought she'd be reading their intentions, exploiting their mistakes, demonstrating a level of technical mastery that made their advantages irrelevant. She wasn't flashy. There were no spinning kicks, no dramatic throws, nothing designed for show. Every movement had purpose. Every technique was fundamental. Every transition was efficient. It was the difference between someone who'd learned combatives from a curriculum and someone who'd been trained by people who'd used these skills to stay alive in places where mistakes meant death. At the 3-minute mark, injuries were accumulating. Dalton had a bloody nose from an accidental elbow during a scramble for position, blood running down his face, dripping onto his PT shirt. Westbrook was favoring his ribs where he'd landed poorly, trying to escape from mount position, each breath visible effort. Brennan was limping on his left ankle from a swept takedown, and his right shoulder was burning, that old injury from Ranger School making itself known. What the spectators couldn't see, what only Elena herself knew, was that she'd identified that shoulder injury early in the exchange. She'd watched Brennan favor it, seen him wince when weight went through it, cataloged it as a weakness she could exploit, and she'd deliberately chosen not to. Every time she could have attacked that shoulder, could have applied pressure to the injury, she'd chosen a different technique instead. Not mercy, professional assessment. She was proving she was better without taking advantage of his vulnerability, demonstrating superiority through pure technical skill rather than exploitation. That's when Brennan's control finally shattered. 4.5 minutes of being dominated by someone he'd dismissed as inadequate. 4.5 minutes of his certainties being systematically demolished. 4.5 minutes of watching everything he believed about size and strength and gender prove insufficient against someone who simply knew more, moved better, understood combat at a deeper level. His ego couldn't absorb it. His worldview couldn't accommodate it. So he abandoned technique entirely and went to pure aggression. He rushed in, no setup, no strategy, just violence. He drove Elena backward and down, using every pound of his 220 to force her to the ground. He locked a guillotine choke around her neck, that standing headlock that could quickly cut off blood flow if applied correctly, and he cranked it. Not progressive resistance, not controlled technique, but maximum force, trying to make her submit through pain and pressure. Elena tapped. 3 clear strikes on his arm, the universal signal to release the submission. He didn't release. He squeezed harder, twisting, trying to force her unconscious, trying to prove his point, through domination that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with ego. Thorne's voice cut across the training area like a whip crack. "Brennan, release. Now that's a direct order." Brennan didn't hear him or didn't care. The red haze of humiliated rage had taken over, reducing everything to the need to win, to dominate, to prove he was stronger. Elena's survival instincts, drilled into her through 1,000 hours of training, activated without conscious thought. This wasn't training anymore. This was a threat, real and immediate, from someone who'd lost control. She responded accordingly. Her right leg hooked behind Brennan's left leg. Her hips bridged explosively upward, generating force from her core, from her legs, from every muscle in her body working in perfect coordination. She used his overcommitment against him, that fundamental principle appearing again, and reversed their positions in a movement so fast the spectators barely tracked it. She transitioned immediately to arm triangle choke, using her arm and Brennan's own shoulder to create the compression, cutting off blood flow to his brain through the carotid arteries. She locked it tight, squeezed with precision and control, applying exactly enough pressure to make the point absolutely clear. Brennan tapped frantically. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Desperate, panicked tapping against her arm, against the mat, against anything his hand could reach. Elena held it for 2 extra seconds, not long enough to cause real damage, but long enough to send an unmistakable message. You didn't release me when I tapped. I'm choosing to release you. Remember this feeling. Remember what it means to be helpless. Remember that I gave you mercy you didn't give me. Then she released, rolled away, and came to her feet. Blood marked her lower lip where it had split during the exchange. Bruises were forming on her neck, visible, even in the afternoon sun. Dark marks that would last for days. Her face held no expression at all. Not anger, not satisfaction, not triumph. Just professional hone the expression of someone who'd done a job and done it correctly. Brennan remained on his hands and knees, coughing violently, one hand at his throat, trying to draw full breaths. His face had gone from red to pale, the color of someone who'd just experienced real fear, who'd felt what it meant to have another person hold their life in their hands and choose to let them live. For the first time since this whole situation began, Jake Brennan understood what he'd actually challenged. Not a diversity hire, not someone who didn't meet standards, but a weapon forged through training he couldn't imagine tested in combat. He'd never experienced carrying skills that made his Ranger qualification look like a participation trophy. The realization showed on his face, visible to everyone watching. Not just defeat, understanding. That's when the voice cut across the training area, loud and commanding, stopping everyone mid-breath. Command Sergeant Major Thorne, hold that formation. Brigadier General Marcus Ashford strode through the gate with his aide and a JAG officer flanking him. Every soldier in the area snapped to attention so fast it looked choreographed. Ashford was 65 years old, carried himself like someone who'd spent decades in command, and when he walked, people moved. When he spoke, people listened. The 2 stars on his collar meant he was one of the most senior officers on the installation, and his reputation meant those stars significantly understated his actual influence. He took his time crossing to the ring, his boots crunching on the red Georgia clay, letting the silence build. When he reached the edge, he surveyed the scene with the expression of someone who had seen exactly what he expected to see and was now deciding what to do about it. Take a knee, he said. His voice wasn't loud, didn't need to be. It carried absolute authority, the kind that came from 30-plus years of commanding soldiers in the worst places on earth. Everyone complied immediately. Brennan, Dalton, and Westbrook knelt where they stood. The spectators in the bleachers remained seated, but went absolutely still. Elena took a knee with the others, though Ashford's eyes tracked to her specifically for just a moment, some unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Thorne remained standing, as was his right as the senior NCO present, but even he looked uncomfortable with what was coming. Ashford clasped his hands behind his back and began speaking in a tone that combined disappointment, calculation, and something harder to define. I've been observing this course for 3 weeks, he said. Received a formal complaint about a soldier allegedly not meeting standards. The complaint was detailed, professional-looking, signed by a Ranger-qualified NCO. So I took it seriously. I reviewed training records. I observed multiple sessions. I consulted with subject matter experts who've trained personnel for missions I still cannot discuss in this setting. He paused, let that information settle like dust after an explosion. Today's demonstration was particularly educational. I watched 3 soldiers attempt to overwhelm one opponent using numerical superiority, significant size advantage, and coordinated tactics. His eyes moved to Brennan, then Dalton, then Westbrook. I watched them fail, comprehensively, and then I watched one of those soldiers lose control, ignore the safety rules, attempt to injure his training partner after she'd tapped in submission. The words fell like hammer blows. Brennan's face had gone pale. Ashford turned to face the full formation, his voice carrying to every person present. How many of you know what Operation Sphinx was? Silence, confused looks, soldiers glancing at each other, trying to determine if this was a test, a trick question, or genuine inquiry. Finally, scattered headshakes. Nobody knew. 18 months ago, Ashford said, the Department of Defense initiated a classified program. The objective was to develop female operators capable of conducting missions in denied environments where male soldiers could not effectively operate. Selection for cultural access, intelligence collection, direct action in contexts that required capabilities the conventional military didn't possess. He let that sink in, watched understanding begin to dawn on faces. Selection standards were equivalent to Special Forces assessment and selection. The training pipeline utilized Tier 1 instructors from across the special operations community. Israeli Krav Maga specialists from Sayeret Matkal, Delta Force close quarters, battle experts, SEAL Team 6 hand-to-hand combat instructors, Ranger qualified physician assistants teaching trauma medicine at the highest level. People were starting to understand where this was going. The noise level dropped to absolute silence. The program operated for 16 months before budget complications and political considerations forced termination. 48 applicants from across the United States Army, infantry, soldiers, military, police, intelligence specialists, combat medics, all volunteers, all with prior deployment experience. Ashford's voice got quieter, which somehow made it more intense. 12 graduated, 12 out of 48. The rest either quit or were cut for not meeting standards. Those 12 women were then deployed on classified missions across multiple theaters, conducting operations I cannot describe in detail, but which directly contributed to national security objectives and saved American lives. He turned and looked directly at Elena, and now everyone followed his gaze. Captain Elena Ravencroft, 8 years of service, infantry, 11 Bravo MOS, deployed to Afghanistan 2000 through 2021, 2nd Battalion 87th Infantry Regiment, Kandahar Province, attached to a female engagement team. The formality of his tone made it clear this was official recognition, not casual conversation. In March 2021, her element was ambushed during village operations near the Pakistani border. The interpreter was killed instantly. The team leader, Major Sarah Callahan, was hit by RPG fragmentation that severed her femoral artery. The team medic was pinned by machine gun fire from 2 positions and could not reach the casualty. People were leaning forward now, caught by the story by the specific details that made it real. Captain Ravencroft low-crawled 40 meters through enemy fire, using an irrigation ditch for concealment, while rounds impacted within inches of her position. She reached Major Callahan, applied a tourniquet while lying prone under fire, and then returned fire with one hand while maintaining direct pressure on the arterial wound site with the other hand, for 9 minutes until air support arrived and medevac could land. Ashford paused for emphasis. The field surgeon's after-action report stated that without that tourniquet application and sustained pressure, Major Callahan would have bled out in under 3 minutes. Captain Ravencroft's actions under fire, her technical medical skill, and her courage saved her team leader's life. Major Callahan survived long enough to reach Bagram, where she ultimately died from complications, but she lived 48 hours longer than she would have without this soldier's intervention. The weight of that settled over the formation like a physical presence. Based on that combat performance, Captain Ravencroft was selected for Operation Sphinx. She completed the 8-month training pipeline and graduated 4th in her class of 12. Hand-to-hand combat proficiency rated at Special Operations Standard, instructor certifications in 3 separate martial arts disciplines, performance evaluations from instructors with more combined combat experience than everyone in this formation, including myself, rated her as exceptionally gifted in close-quarters combat. Ashford's voice dropped to almost a whisper, which made every word cut deeper. So tell me, Staff Sergeant Brennan, after watching what just occurred, after attempting to choke her unconscious when she tapped, after she could have broken your arm, dislocated your shoulder that you injured at Ranger School, or rendered you unconscious but chose not to. After she demonstrated technical superiority against 3 opponents simultaneously, do you still believe Captain Ravencroft doesn't meet standards? Brennan couldn't speak. His mouth opened again. No sound emerged. What could he possibly say? Every assumption he'd made had been proven wrong. Every certainty had been shattered. He'd challenged someone who operated at a level he couldn't comprehend, and she'd made it look easy. Ashford let the silence hang for a long moment, then continued. I was Operation Sphinx's military advocate at the Pentagon. I fought to keep that program alive when political winds shifted against it. I lost that battle. Budget constraints, political considerations, concerns about public perception. The program was terminated during records sanitized the 12 graduates scattered back to conventional assignments. His expression hardened. But I made damn sure those 12 women were protected. I made sure their service records were flagged appropriately. I made sure they had advocates if institutional resistance emerged. And I've been waiting to see if any of them would step forward to teach to pass on what they learned to continue the legacy even though the program officially never existed. He looked at Elena with something that might have been pride. Captain Ravencroft is the first. She volunteered for this instructor course, not because she's running from her past, but because she's weaponizing it. She's here to teach the next generation of soldiers what she learned in places I cannot name, doing things I cannot describe at a level most of you will never reach. Ashford turned back to the full formation. The United States Army is better for having soldiers like Captain Ravencroft. Soldiers who've proven themselves in combat. Soldiers who've completed training that most male soldiers couldn't pass. Soldiers who understand that capability has no gender requirement, that competence is demonstrated through performance, and that the warrior ethos transcends any demographic category. He let that settle, then delivered the final blow. I'm directing the following actions. Staff Sergeant Brennan, you will receive a General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand for training safety violations. You will be reassigned to Fort Cavazos, Texas, pending a formal investigation. You are removed from this course effective immediately. Brennan's career was over. A Gomor was career-ending for an NCO. He'd never be promoted again, would likely be forced out at his current rank. The realization showed on his face, stark and final. Sergeant Dalton, you will receive a written counseling statement and mandatory professional military education retraining. You will continue in this course under probationary status. Dalton nodded mutely, understanding he had been given a second chance he didn't deserve. Specialist Westbrook, you are removed from this course and returned to your basic unit. Given your age and the influence of senior personnel in this situation, you will not face additional disciplinary action. Learn from this. Westbrook's relief was visible, mixed with shame. Command Sergeant Major Frank Garrison will be retiring effective immediately. The nature of his involvement in this situation has been documented. That was the hammer blow nobody had expected. Garrison, the senior NCO who'd been manipulating events from behind the scenes, was being forced out. Ashford's influence had reached that high, moved that fast, delivered consequences that severe. Finally, Ashford looked at Elena. Captain Ravencroft, you will continue in this course. Based on your performance to date, I expect you'll graduate at the top of your class. The United States Army needs instructors of your caliber. Carry on. Elena came to her feet, stood at attention. Yes, sir. Ashford nodded once, then addressed the full formation a final time. Everyone here witnessed something important today. You witnessed what happens when assumption meets reality, when prejudice meets performance, when someone who's been underestimated demonstrates exactly why that underestimation was a mistake. Remember this, learn from it, and understand that the military is changing, must change, will change, regardless of anyone's personal comfort with that change. Dismissed. The formation broke. Soldiers moved away in clusters, talking in low voices, processing what they'd witnessed. The spectators in the bleachers filed out slowly, many of them looking back at Elena, with expressions ranging from respect to awe to confusion. 5 days later, the official actions came through exactly as Ashford had promised. Brennan received his Gomor and orders to Fort Cavazos. Garrison's retirement was processed with unusual speed. Dalton and Westbrook received their counseling and continued with their assignments, both of them noticeably quieter, notably more professional. Elena continued the instructor course. She trained, she taught, she demonstrated, she helped other students improve. Nobody made comments about diversity anymore. Nobody questioned whether she belonged. The dragon tattoo on her wrist became something people noticed and wondered about, but didn't ask about directly. Command Sergeant Major Thorne found her 2 days after the incident, standing near the training area, watching a new class run through basic grappling progressions. He approached carefully, hands visible, body language open. Captain, he said, I should have stopped it sooner, should have protected you better, should have recognized what Garrison was building toward and shut it down before it got to that point. Elena looked at him with those calm eyes that had seen too much. You couldn't have stopped it, Sergeant Major. Not really. Even if you denied the specific match, the attitude would have remained. The belief that I don't belong, that standards were lowered, that my presence undermines the institution. This wasn't about one training evolution. It was about a lesson that multiple people needed to learn. Still, I should have done better. You approved it with safety measures. You were ready to intervene. You did your job. And now everyone who watched learned something they wouldn't have learned any other way. Sometimes education requires demonstration. Thorne studied her face. Gulf War taught me a lot of lessons. One of them was that women are force multipliers in ways the conventional military didn't want to acknowledge. Took us 40 years to start catching up to that reality. Keep teaching, Captain. We need it. The following Monday, Elena stood in front of a formation of 28 soldiers beginning their Level 4 combative certification. She didn't mention what had happened, didn't reference her background, didn't explain the dragon tattoo. She simply demonstrated a technique, a basic hip throw from collar-tie position, broke it down into components, and asked for volunteers to practice. Specialist Derek Maddox stepped forward first, the young soldier who'd warned her about Brennan's plans. Then a staff sergeant who'd been in the audience during the match. Then two more. Then another. Then the entire class was engaged, asking questions, taking notes, treating her exactly like what she was, an expert teaching her craft. After class, Maddox approached near the equipment shed. He looked uncertain, like someone working up courage to ask a difficult question. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "is it true what General Ashford said about Operation Sphinx? About the training, the missions, all of it?" Elena looked at him for a long moment, evaluating whether this was appropriate, whether answering would violate security protocols, whether the truth would help or hurt. Finally, she rolled up her right sleeve slightly, just enough to show the small dragon tattoo on her inner wrist. "The program doesn't exist anymore," she said carefully. "Officially, it never existed at all. But what it taught us, what we learned, that doesn't disappear just because paperwork gets destroyed. Skills don't vanish when institutions fail. Knowledge persists. You want to learn what I can teach, I'll teach you. Not because you're special, because you're willing to work." Maddox nodded slowly, something like reverence in his expression. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely. My uncle always said the military would be better when it figured out how to use all its warriors properly. I think he was right. Your uncle sounds like a wise man. Tell him thank you for his service and for teaching his nephew to think clearly." That evening, Elena sat in her barracks room, door open, to catch the breeze, cleaning her boots with the methodical care her father had instilled in her decades ago. The two sets of dog tags sat on her wall locker, Callahan's and Torres's, catching the last light from the window. She thought about the other 11 women from Operation Sphinx scattered across installations worldwide, carrying the same mark, the same skills, the same burden of being too capable to be believed, but too classified to be acknowledged. Her phone rang. She smiled when she saw the caller ID. "Dad?" "Elena, how did it go?" She told him everything. The match, the intervention, Ashford's speech, the aftermath. Thomas Ravencroft listened without interrupting, the way he'd always listened, giving her space to process through speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would be proud," he said finally. "God rest her soul, she would have loved to see this. So am I. So are the others. I talked to Gunny in Chief and the Colonel this morning. They're calling you the Dragon Lady at the VFW Hall. They mean it as the highest possible compliment. Tell them thank you. Tell them everything they taught me mattered. It all came together yesterday in ways they'd understand. They know, Elena, you understand what you did right. You didn't just win a fight. You taught a lesson that'll ripple out beyond Fort Moore. Every person who watched, who heard about it, who tells the story to someone else. You proved something important. That the old ways, the fundamental skills, the warrior knowledge we pass down, it transcends demographics. It's about competence, not categories. That's what I hoped. Visit next month. The guys want to see you, want to hear the stories you can tell, want to know their work mattered. It did matter, Dad. Every hour you spent teaching me, every lesson, every principle, all of it prepared me for this." After they hung up, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Encrypted sender, anonymous, but she recognized the protocol. One of the other Sphinx graduates. 11 sisters watching. We saw what you did. General Ashford made sure we knew. The Dragon legacy continues through you. Proud doesn't cover it. Denver next month. All 12. Time to discuss our future. Viper. Elena stared at the message for a long moment. Catherine Voss, their training officer, their advocate, still protecting them from the shadows, still maintaining the network, still ensuring the sisterhood endured even though the institution that created it had been erased. She typed a quick response. "I'll be there." Reaper. Elena set the phone down and looked at the dragon tattoo on her wrist. Tomorrow she would teach. The work continued. The legacy endured.